Picture this, a bustling medieval marketplace, the air thick with the warm, comforting scent of freshly baked bread. But beneath that ordinary scene, something extraordinary was happening. In the hands of skilled bakers, every loaf held more than just flour and water. It carried whispers of defiance, hidden messages meant to challenge the very rulers who sought to control them. This wasn't just food, it was a secret language, a tool of resistance baked into the very fabric of daily life. For centuries, bread has been a symbol of sustenance, community, and survival. But in medieval Europe, it became something more, a silent weapon against oppression. Kings and nobles imposed heavy taxes on grain, dictating who could eat and who would starve. Yet bakers, often seen as humble tradesmen, found ingenious ways to fight back. They shaped their loaves not just for nourishment but for rebellion, embedding codes and symbols that only their communities could understand. A twist in the crust, a deliberate imperfection in the shape, each detail carried meaning, a quiet act of defiance against unjust rule. What if I told you that the bread you see today has ancestors steeped in this secret history? This video is your ticket to uncovering that hidden world. We'll peel back the layers of time to reveal how bakers turned their ovens into hubs of resistance, how something as simple as a loaf could unite a town against tyranny. By the end, you'll see bread not just as a staple of life, but as a testament to human ingenuity and courage. So stay with me, because the story of the secret code of bread loaves is about to change the way you think about history, one slice at a time. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just part of the meal, it was the meal. For most people, it made up nearly 70% of their daily diet, a staggering fact that shows just how vital bakers were to keeping society running. Imagine entire towns where a single bad harvest or unfair tax could mean the difference between survival and starvation. That's why controlling grain wasn't just about economics for kings and nobles, it was about power. Whoever held the flour held the people's fate in their hands. Authorities imposed brutal regulations, from price controls on loaves to laws preventing bakers from selling directly to the public. Some rulers even demanded that all grain pass through royal granaries first, creating choke points where they could take their cut. But here's where things get interesting. The very system meant to control bakers gave them unexpected leverage. Because they were the ones who transformed raw grain into something edible, they occupied a unique position close enough to the powerful to learn their secrets, but trusted by common folk as one of their own. And so the quiet resistance began. In some towns, bakers deliberately underweighted loaves meant for tax collectors while giving fuller portions to their neighbors. Others developed special markings. A cross cut into the crust might signal that soldiers were nearby, while a loaf left unsold at day's end could mean a secret meeting after dark. These weren't random acts, they were calculated strikes against a system that treated bread as currency and people as numbers. The ovens became hubs of information, with every batch of dough carrying more than just yeast. It carried the hopes of a community pushing back against the weight of royal greed. What's remarkable is how these acts of defiance blurred the line between survival and rebellion. A baker couldn't openly challenge the king, but they could bake a loaf that fed a rebel. They couldn't refuse an order, but they could shape bread in ways that sent messages only the hungry would understand. This was resistance baked into the everyday, proof that even the most tightly controlled systems have cracks, and sometimes those cracks smell like freshly baked bread. Royal authorities didn't just control bread, they weaponized it. Imagine living under laws where the weight, price, and even the shape of your daily loaf were dictated by distant rulers who'd never known hunger. In 14th century England, the assize of bread and ale fixed prices so low that honest bakers couldn't survive without cheating the system, turning them into criminals by design. France's royal granaries forced peasants to sell their grain at pitiful rates, only to watch nobles resell it back to them as expensive flour. These weren't mere regulations, they were traps, squeezing both bakers and buyers in a vise of manufactured scarcity. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Records from medieval Normandy tell of bakers publicly whipped for selling undersized loaves, while in Florence, the punishment for hiding grain from tax collectors could mean losing a hand. The message was clear: bread belonged to the crown, not the people who baked or ate it. Yet paradoxically, this oppression forged an unbreakable bond between bakers and their communities. When officials in Ghent demanded every loaf bear the king's seal, bakers responded by imprinting hidden marks. A tiny notch near the base might indicate contraband flour was available after dark, while a deliberately lopsided shape could warn of tax inspectors in the area. What makes these acts so remarkable is their duality. A baker might present perfect, regulation loaves to authorities while keeping a second batch under the counter, slightly heavier, slightly cheaper, baked with grain smuggled past royal checkpoints. In doing so, they turned their bakeries into hubs of quiet subversion. The flour dust covering their aprons wasn't just residue, it was the fingerprints of resistance. And when whole villages began recognizing these edible codes, a certain braid pattern meaning "safe to talk here," or a burnt crust signaling "soldiers on the road," bread transcended food entirely. It became parchment, ink, and messenger all in one, written in a language only the hungry could decipher. This silent rebellion reveals a profound truth about power: control the food, and you control the people unless the people learn to speak through their supper. While kings saw bread as a commodity to be taxed, bakers and their customers transformed it into something far more dangerous, a symbol of collective defiance, warm from the oven and impossible to suppress. The artistry of bread making became the perfect cover for rebellion. In a world where speaking against the crown could mean imprisonment or worse, bakers turned their craft into a canvas for coded communication. Take the simple round loaf, ubiquitous and unremarkable to royal inspectors, but in certain towns, a slight indentation near the base transformed it into a signal. This tiny deviation might tell villagers that a shipment of untaxed grain had arrived under cover of darkness. More elaborate designs carried even bolder messages. In 14th century Flanders, bakers perfected a braided loaf resembling a crown but with one deliberate flaw. The twisted dough intentionally omitted a single point, a silent jab at the king's authority that those in the know would recognize. Elsewhere, a loaf scored with 7 cuts instead of the traditional 5 became shorthand for the 7 grievances locals held against their lord. Even the scoring patterns, the shallow cuts bakers make before baking, took on meaning. Parallel lines might indicate safe passage for fugitives, while crossed cuts warned of checkpoints on the roads, some of the most ingenious codes hid in plain sight. French bakers near the Pyrenees developed a mountain loaf, with one end dramatically higher than the other. To officials, it was just rustic baking. To villagers, the steep angle pointed toward hidden caves where contraband flour was stored. In Germany, a particular baker gained fame for his owl bread, a loaf shaped with 2 pronounced ears at the top. The design referenced a local legend about wise owls outsmarting hunters, a not-so-subtle metaphor for bakers evading tax collectors. What made these edible codes so effective was their deniability. A royal official might suspect something amiss with an oddly shaped loaf, but without proof, punishing a baker for poor craftsmanship risked sparking unrest. And so the bread spoke volumes through its curves, its textures, its very imperfections, carrying truths too dangerous to say aloud. Every kneaded fold and intentional scorch mark became part of a culinary underground, one that turned the most basic of human needs into a tool of quiet revolution. Perhaps the most daring were the mirror loaves of medieval Italy, round breads with one side perfectly smooth and the other deliberately rough. To the wealthy who bought them, it was mere aesthetic variation. But to the poor who received secretly donated loaves, the rough side indicated which bakeries would trade bread for information about troop movements or tax collection routes. This edible semaphore system grew so sophisticated that some towns could coordinate entire protests just by the varieties of bread set out on market stalls at dawn. The true genius of these designs lay in their ephemeral nature. Unlike pamphlets or graffiti that could be used as evidence, rebellious bread disappeared the moment it was eaten, leaving authorities chasing crumbs while the message had already been digested. In a world where parchment was scarce and literacy rare, dough became the perfect medium for dissent. Every oven's glow wasn't just baking bread. It was forging the iron will of communities who refused to be starved into submission. Among the most daring symbols baked into bread was the Liberty loaf, a simple round shape marked with a deep cross. To the untrained eye, it might look like standard scoring to help the bread bake evenly. But to those resisting royal control, that cross represented the four corners of their community coming together against oppression. In some French villages, receiving this loaf meant it was time to gather at midnight for secret meetings. The bread itself became an invitation, edible proof that you could trust the hands that made it. Even more ingenious was the hollow loaf, a masterpiece of deception. Outwardly, it met all royal weight requirements, but inside, bakers left a carefully carved cavity. These hidden spaces smuggled extra flour to families on the brink of starvation, or tucked away scraps of parchment with news from neighboring towns. Some bakers took this further, baking hollow loaves with false bottoms. Tax inspectors would weigh them and find nothing amiss, while starving children received loaves that miraculously contained small coins or strips of dried fruit concealed within. The boldest designs mocked power directly. In Bohemia, bakers crafted loaves resembling miniature crowns, their dough jewels made of hardened sugar that crunching teeth would reduce to dust, a not-so-subtle metaphor for royal authority crumbling under the people's resolve. Others shaped scepters from bread, only to have them broken apart and shared among crowds during festivals, turning symbols of monarchy into communal meals. One rebellious baker in Burgundy famously presented his lord with a loaf shaped like a gallows, the rope made of twisted dough, a silent warning that even kings weren't beyond judgment. What gave these edible symbols such power was their fleeting nature. Unlike graffiti or pamphlets that could be torn down, rebellious bread served its purpose quickly. By the time authorities realized a loaf's meaning, it had already been eaten, its message digested into the bodies and memories of those who needed it most. This was resistance designed to vanish without a trace except in the hearts of those who understood the language of flour and fire. The most sophisticated codes combined design with distribution. In Italian city-states, certain bakeries developed a system where the day's first loaf sold signaled whether it was safe to speak freely. A spiral-shaped bread meant spies were nearby. A star-patterned crust indicated allies were present. Some bakers even arranged their market stalls like chessboards. Loaves placed in specific positions revealed which roads were guarded or where rebel messengers might hide. This turned entire town squares into living, breathing maps of resistance, written in rye and wheat. Perhaps the most poignant of all were the memory loaves, breads baked with ingredients smuggled from forbidden recipes. Jewish bakers under persecution hid matzo techniques in seemingly ordinary loaves, while Celtic communities preserved oatcake traditions despite English laws banning them. In these cases, the bread wasn't just carrying messages, it was keeping entire cultures alive, one secret ingredient at a time. When you bit into such a loaf, you weren't just tasting flour and water, you were tasting defiance, heritage, and the unbroken will of people who refused to let their traditions be erased. This edible rebellion reached its peak during peasant uprisings, when loaves became literal rallying flags. During the Flanders Revolt of 1323, rebels marched behind banners shaped like giant bread rolls. In the English peasants' revolt 60 years later, protesters pinned crusts to their hats as identification, a carb-based version of military insignia. The very substance meant to keep them docile became the uniform of their uprising. Royal chroniclers wrote with horror of bread armies, whose weapons were rolling pins and whose battle cries smelled of fresh bakeries. The brilliance of these designs lay in their simplicity. No special tools were needed, just skilled hands and communal trust. A baker might teach their child to shape a certain loaf only after swearing them to secrecy, turning family recipes into acts of generational defiance. In this way, bread became more than survival, it became a living language, one that authorities couldn't confiscate because it existed in the motion of hands kneading dough, the heat of communal ovens, and the shared hunger for justice that no royal decree could ever satisfy. The most daring bakers didn't just shape their loaves, they filled them with secrets. In medieval Lyon, hollowed-out bread concealed tiny scrolls detailing tax collection routes, allowing entire villages to avoid royal inspectors. A single loaf could hold directions to hidden grain stores or names of sympathetic nobles written in edible ink made from berry juice. These edible letters were especially clever. If discovered, the evidence could be eaten in seconds, leaving nothing but full stomachs and empty hands for frustrated authorities. But why stop at parchment? Some bakers turned crumbs themselves into coded trail markers. During the Flemish uprisings, rebels followed carefully placed breadcrumbs through city alleys, not random scatterings but deliberate patterns. 3 crumbs in a triangle meant a safe house ahead. A straight line warned of soldiers around the corner. This edible breadcrumb trail became so sophisticated that bakers developed special crumb loaves with extra crispy crusts designed to break in precise ways when dropped. Even broken bread carried meaning. In Bohemia, receiving half a loaf wasn't an insult, it was an invitation. The way the bread was torn mattered. A clean break signaled an open meeting, while jagged edges meant danger. Some communities developed entire bread languages, where the placement of crust shards on windowsills indicated whether fugitives could seek shelter or if informants were nearby. A crust pointing north might mean escape routes clear, while crumbs sprinkled eastward warned approach with caution. The true brilliance of this system lay in its deniability. Royal officials might grow suspicious of frequent bread deliveries between towns, but proving treason was nearly impossible when the messages were literally consumed. One baker in Normandy famously told interrogators, "I sell bread, not words. If your spies found nothing, perhaps they should have looked harder before eating the evidence." This edible espionage network thrived precisely because it left no paper trail, just satisfied customers and frustrated tax collectors. Coordination between cities required astonishing creativity. Baker apprentices traveling for training became message carriers, memorizing recipes that were actually coded instructions. The ratio of ingredients in a family recipe might correspond to dates 3 parts flour to 1 part salt could mean March 1st. Guild festivals turned into covert planning sessions, where bread baking competitions hid strategic discussions. The winner's loaf, displayed publicly, often contained hidden markings visible only to those who knew where to look. Some rebellions were literally baked into existence. When the salt tax sparked protests in Western France, bakers produced deliberately oversalted loaves, a culinary protest that made every bite a reminder of injustice. In England, bread distributed to striking wool workers contained tiny charcoal marks indicating which houses would provide sanctuary. The system grew so refined that during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebel leaders coordinated attacks using nothing but variations on standard market loaves, their shapes, textures, and distribution patterns conveying troop movements to entire regions. Perhaps the most touching messages were those meant for future generations. In Jewish communities under persecution, challah bread sometimes concealed tiny strips of parchment with Torah verses or family histories. These edible time capsules ensured traditions survived even when scriptures had to be hidden. Similarly, Celtic bakers in Scotland encoded clan histories in the intricate braiding of their breads, a practice that continued covertly for centuries under English rule. This culinary resistance network had one unbreakable rule: trust no one who couldn't bake. The shared labor of kneading and firing ovens created bonds stronger than any written oath. When authorities in Augsburg tried planting spies in bakeries, the imposters were quickly identified not through interrogation, but by their inability to properly shape dough. The true test of allegiance wasn't what you said, but how you folded the rebellion into every loaf. The legacy of these edible codes lives on in unexpected ways. Modern breads still bear decorative scoring patterns descended from those medieval signals. That lattice top on your fruit loaf, it traces back to Bavarian bakers marking safe houses. The cross on hot cross buns, originally a secret symbol among English rebels, even today's artisan bread movements carry echoes of that defiant spirit, because when you shape dough by hand, you're participating in a tradition that once fed not just bodies but revolutions. Beneath the watchful eyes of royal officials, an entire shadow society of bakers flourished, one built on whispered recipes and midnight ovens. These weren't just tradesmen, they were operatives in a vast underground network stretching across kingdoms. In Cologne, a baker might receive an ordinary-looking loaf from a traveling merchant, only to find the crust scored with tiny notches indicating which noble households were stockpiling grain. In Toulouse, guild apprentices learned secret kneading techniques that doubled as cipher systems, the number of folds corresponding to dates of upcoming tax collections. The system relied on absolute trust, enforced not by laws but by necessity. Bakers caught leaking secrets faced punishments far worse than royal reprisals. Expulsion from the network meant losing access to the hidden flour routes, smuggled yeast starters, and emergency shelters that kept their communities alive. Some guilds developed elaborate initiation rituals, like the Breton bakers who required new members to bake a silent loaf, a bread made without uttering a single word from mixing to cooling. Only those who could work under such pressure were deemed reliable. Among the most legendary figures was Mathilda of Arras, a baker's daughter who turned her family's ovens into a regional command center. When Duke Philip's soldiers began seizing grain stores, Mathilda organized a system where every third loaf baked in participating shops contained hollow compartments. These held maps of alternative grain storage sites, written in charcoal on edible rice paper. Her network grew so efficient that during the famine of 1328, Arras became the only town in the region where no one starved, despite royal records showing it should have been hardest hit. Then there was Klaus the Twice-Baked, a Nuremberg baker famous for surviving 2 public burnings, or so the story goes. After his first arrest for distributing seditious sourdough, Klaus escaped by swapping places with a straw-stuffed dummy in his prison bakery. He resurfaced years later under a new identity, teaching apprentices how to bake mirror bread loaves with one side perfectly smooth for inspectors and the other side textured with hidden messages. When caught again, he allegedly convinced his executioners the pyre was just another oven, walking into the flames while reciting baking instructions as if making one final loaf. The network's true power lay in its adaptability. When Parisian authorities banned nighttime baking to prevent secret meetings, bakers developed cold-proof breads that rose slowly without heat, giving cover for all-night gatherings where the sound of kneading masked whispered plans. Italian guilds took this further, creating flour codes where different textures signaled different messages. Coarse ground rye meant danger, while finely sifted spelt indicated safe passage. Some of the most ingenious communications happened in plain sight. At the Great Market in Ghent, bakers arranged their stalls to form living infographics, the positioning of rye versus wheat loaves indicating which city gates were heavily guarded. In Prague, the angle at which a baker wiped flour from their apron could direct rebels to hidden cellars. These subtle signals turned everyday actions into an unbreakable code, one that royal spies could observe but never decipher. The longevity of these networks is perhaps their most remarkable feat. In some towns, rebel baking techniques were passed down through families for over 200 years. A 14th-century Venetian baker's journal discovered in 2018 contained what appeared to be bread recipes until scholars realized the rising times corresponded to encrypted dates of secret grain shipments. This wasn't just resistance, it was an edible tradition, proving that while kings could raise armies, bakers raised something far more enduring: the daily bread that kept rebellion alive in every hungry bite. Jean of Flanders wasn't just a baker, she was a smuggler, a spy, and a savior. Operating from a dimly lit cellar in 14th-century Bruges, she perfected the art of the prison loaf, hollowing out rye bread to hide tiny files and messages for captured rebels. Her most daring delivery, a loaf stuffed with a map inked in beet juice, guiding 6 prisoners through sewer tunnels to freedom. When authorities finally raided her bakery, they found nothing but perfectly ordinary bread cooling on the racks. Jean had trained her entire neighborhood to bake identical loaves, creating edible camouflage that made evidence impossible to trace. Then there was Thomas the Baker of York, a man whose wit was as sharp as his kneading blade. When royal inspectors demanded he prove his loaves met weight standards, Thomas presented a single, regulation-perfect bread, while secretly instructing customers to bring their own weights to market. Townsfolk would place their purchases on the scales, only to discover each loaf miraculously matched the required heaviness. By the time inspectors realized the weights had been tampered with, Thomas had already switched to a new trick: baking loaves with dense, moisture-rich centers that lightened as they cooled, passing inspection before shrinking into something more generous. His greatest legacy, teaching an entire generation that fairness could be baked into the system, one clever loophole at a time. In the Alpine villages of Switzerland, baker Anna of Bern turned her ovens into weapons of psychological warfare. After Duke Leopold's soldiers seized her village grain stores, Anna began baking loaves shaped like hanged men, complete with nooses of braided dough. She left these grim figures at the soldiers' barracks each dawn, a silent protest that grew more elaborate with each passing week. First, the breadmen wore tiny dough helmets, then their edible faces began resembling specific officers. The effect was so unnerving that within 2 months, the occupation force requested transfer, citing unwholesome conditions. Anna's bread dolls became legend, inspiring the Swiss practice of shaping festive holiday loaves into whimsical figures, a tradition that began as edible satire. The stories grow bolder further east. In Prague, Master Jan the Black, named for his flour-stained apron, orchestrated an entire rebellion from his basement bakery. His specialty, clock bread, loaves marked with 12 raisins whose positions indicated meeting times. When authorities banned gatherings of more than 3 people, Jan developed a system where the type of bread left on windowsills signaled staggered arrival times, creating the illusion of random comings and goings while secretly assembling hundreds. His most famous creation was the Thunder Loaf, a dense bread containing saltpeter scraps that could be extracted to make crude gunpowder, earning him the nickname, the baker who armed Bohemia. What made these figures so dangerous to authorities wasn't just their actions, but their reach. A noble could execute one rebel baker, but doing so often turned them into martyrs. When Marguerite of Provence was burned at the stake for baking heretical shapes, her fellow bakers responded by producing thousands of loaves bearing her initials in scored crusts, a mass act of defiance that forced the king to pardon her posthumously rather than face daily reminders of his cruelty. Similarly, when Spanish authorities arrested Eduardo the Kneader for teaching bread-based codes to Moorish rebels, his students flooded Toledo's markets with deliberately misshapen loaves, each deformity representing a different letter in the Arabic alphabet, spelling out protests in edible script. These bakers understood something revolutionary. In societies where most couldn't read, dough was a democratic medium. A poem carved in stone might inspire scholars, but a loaf shaped like a crown with a broken tip spoke to every hungry soul who clutched it. That's why their legends endured long after the ovens cooled, not just in songs, but in the very rituals of baking. Even today, French bakers performing the traditional tap test on baguettes are echoing the coded knocks rebel bakers used to identify safe houses. The crisp crust you prefer, that texture was perfected not for taste, but because it made better hiding places for smuggled messages. Every time you break bread, you're handling the edible legacy of these culinary insurgents. Their greatest victory wasn't any single act, but the way they transformed necessity into resistance. When authorities controlled the grain, bakers controlled the meaning. When kings demanded uniformity, they crafted delicious disobedience. And when history tried to erase their names, they left their signatures in something far more enduring than parchment, in the golden brown crust of every loaf that carried not just nourishment, but the stubborn hope that no tyranny can survive forever when people decide to break bread together. Nowhere was this lesson more explosive than in the bread riots that would soon sweep Europe, where the quiet language of flour and yeast would give way to the roaring demand for justice. But that's a story for another loaf. Bread riots weren't spontaneous outbursts of hunger, they were carefully orchestrated acts of defiance, with bakers often serving as both instigators and quartermasters. Picture the streets of 14th century Paris during the Flour War. As royal granaries overflowed while children starved, bakeries became rallying points. But these weren't chaotic mobs, they operated with military precision. Bakers would distribute specially marked loaves to trusted allies, their crusts notched to indicate meeting times or scoring patterns, revealing which noble estates to target first. The anatomy of these uprisings reveals astonishing sophistication. In the English town of Bury St. Edmunds, rioters followed a bread trail, dozens of small rolls placed at intervals leading to the tax collector's house. Norwich's rebellion began when bakers flooded the market with deliberately burnt loaves, their charred surfaces symbolizing royal greed consuming the people's sustenance. Some baker-led revolts employed edible disguises. Protesters carried normal-looking loaves hollowed out to hide stones, turning breakfast into ammunition when confrontation erupted. What made these events truly revolutionary was their targeting. Unlike random vandalism, bread rioters focused with surgical precision on symbols of oppression. During the 1382 London uprising, crowds bypassed wealthy homes to sack only the grain warehouses of nobles who'd supported harsh taxes. In France's Jacquerie Revolt, protesters used bread knives to shred tax ledgers while leaving other documents untouched, a culinary form of economic sabotage. The most effective riots weaponized bread's sacred status. When authorities in Ghent arrested baker rebels, protesters piled thousands of loaves before the courthouse, creating an edible barricade that took soldiers days to clear. Italian rioters took this further during the Ciompi Revolt. They baked a 300-pound Liberty loaf studded with nails and dragged it through Florence behind horses, transforming food into a battering ram against palace gates. Royal responses reveal how terrified authorities were of these edible insurrections. After the 1358 Paris riots, King John outlawed gatherings near bakeries only for bakers to communicate through bread delivery routes instead. When Flanders banned communal ovens, rebels built makeshift bakeries in forest clearings, their smoke trails becoming beacons for the disenfranchised. The backlash reached its peak in England, where Henry Roman IV decreed bakers must stamp their names on every loaf, not for quality control, but to identify who baked protest bread. Yet the ultimate testament to these riots' power lies in their victories. The famous Boston bread riot of 1714 didn't just feed the hungry, it forced the governor to cap grain prices statewide. In France, the Flour War uprisings of 1775 achieved what philosophers' pamphlets couldn't, convincing Louis Roman XVI to deregulate the grain trade months before the more famous Bastille uprising. Time and again, when parchment petitions failed, bread crusts scrawled with demands succeeded where ink and sealing wax had not. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in how these events blurred the line between sustenance and sedition. A loaf thrown through a tax collector's window wasn't just vandalism, it was the people's wheat returned to its rightful owners. When bakers distributed strike bread with hollow centers during guild protests, they weren't just skimping on flour, they were crafting edible metaphors for what royal policies had stolen from the poor. Every crumb became a bullet in this war, every oven a factory of dissent. Now we approach the darkest chapter, the brutal royal crackdowns that sought to extinguish this fiery resistance once and for all. But as we'll soon see, even the sharpest blades couldn't slice through the enduring spirit baked into every defiant loaf. Royal authorities didn't just punish rebel bakers, they tried to erase their very craft. In 15th century France, King Louis Roman XI issued an edict banning all bread scoring, declaring that even decorative cuts could hide seditious symbols. Inspectors carried bread gauges, iron templates that loaves had to fit perfectly, leaving no room for creative shaping, the punishment for deviation. Public branding with a hot iron shaped like a misshapen loaf, marking the baker as a criminal for life. Yet this oppression sparked astonishing ingenuity. When inspectors outlawed cross-shaped scoring in Bavaria, bakers responded by developing the angel's wing pattern, two graceful arcs that met at the center, forming the same sacred symbol under a different name. In York, authorities banned braided challah bread, fearing its twists could signal rebel messages. Jewish bakers circumvented this by creating ladder loaves, stacked layers that, when pulled apart, revealed the same three-stranded structure in vertical form. Religious symbolism became the perfect cover for resistance. A loaf shaped like a fish might seem innocently Christian to inspectors, but to initiates, its scales carried coded notches indicating safe houses. The crown couldn't outlaw Eucharistic bread, so bakers in Aragon began producing oversized communion wafers, their delicate perforations forming maps of royal grain storehouses when held to the light. Even the humble pretzel, originally a monk's invention, took on new meaning when Nuremberg bakers twisted the dough to represent bound prisoners' hands. The most daring fused baking with outright satire. When Pope Pius Roman II allied with Hungary's repressive King Matthias, Italian bakers created the papal loaf, a hollow sphere with a tiny dough figure trapped inside, symbolizing the Church's captivity to temporal power. In response to Spanish persecution of conversos, Jewish bakers secretly shaped marzipan into miniature Torah scrolls, hiding them inside otherwise Christian-looking Easter breads. These edible blasphemies carried enormous risk. A baker in Seville was burned at the stake for molding dough into a crown of thorns with the king's face at its center. Persecution reached its peak during the Reformation, when bread became theological battleground. Protestant bakers in Geneva scored their loaves with a single deep cut mocking the Catholic five-wound crucifixion symbolism. Catholic bakers retaliated with heretic buns, deliberately overbaked to resemble charred martyrs. The violence wasn't just symbolic. When Lutheran bakers in Augsburg began producing square communion bread to reject transubstantiation, Catholic mobs destroyed their ovens. Through it all, the sacred and the subversive remained inextricably linked. German Anabaptists fleeing persecution baked ark bread, shaped like Noah's vessel, its hollow interior large enough to hide baptismal records. French Huguenots developed a bread with 7 distinct layers, one for each day of creation, that could be peeled apart to reveal Protestant psalms baked between the strata. Even the simple act of breaking bread took on new danger, as authorities realized that shared loaves often preceded underground worship services. What made this resistance so powerful was its divine ambiguity. A baker could swear before the Inquisition that his elaborate loaf was just a pious offering, while every hungry congregant knew it carried their forbidden liturgy in edible form. The very act of consuming these symbolic loaves became sacramental, not just bread transformed into body, but rebellion transformed into sustenance. When authorities in Toulouse demanded all bakeries display crosses, clever bakers complied by crafting bread crosses so large they blocked the doors of tax collectors' offices. This holy defiance reached its poetic peak with the resurrection loaves of persecuted Waldensians. Before being arrested, bakers would prepare dough with extra yeast, timing it to rise explosively in cold prison cells, miraculous swelling that terrified guards and inspired fellow prisoners. Some even baked tiny slips of scripture into the center of these loaves, so when they burst open during baking, the revealed verses seemed to literally spring from the bread itself. The ultimate irony, many symbols authorities tried to suppress eventually became mainstream. The pretzel's twisted rebellion evolved into a beloved snack. Hot cross buns, once banned for their subversive symbolism, now grace supermarket shelves worldwide. Even the humble baguette's distinctive slash patterns descend from medieval bakers' secret scoring codes. What kings and cardinals labeled as treason, time has remembered as tradition, proof that while empires can burn books, they've never managed to outlaw the language of flour and fire. The cross-shaped loaf sitting on a medieval baker's shelf wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a masterpiece of misdirection. By embedding their rebellion in religious iconography, bakers turned the church's own imagery into a shield against persecution. A fish-shaped loaf might honor Christ to inspectors, but to initiates, the number of scales along its side revealed how many royal tax collectors were stationed nearby. In Catalonia, bakers swore their star-patterned bread represented the Star of Bethlehem, never mind that the points aligned perfectly with the locations of hidden grain stores. Some took this holy subterfuge even further. A Bavarian baker arrested for suspicious loaf shapes famously claimed the Virgin Mary herself had appeared in his dreams, instructing him to bake 3 knotted rolls. When local clergy, eager to validate miracles, endorsed his story, the Duke had no choice but to release him. Soon, entire villages were receiving divine visions, mandating specific bread designs, turning divine intervention into the ultimate legal defense. The most ingenious hid their codes in plain sight through Eucharistic symbolism. In regions where only priests could read Latin, bakers scored communion wafers with tiny patterns that mimicked sacred monograms, but to literate rebels they spelled out warnings. One French monastery's records describe a host so delicately perforated that when held at dawn, sunlight projected a map of troop movements onto the chapel wall. Others baked resurrection bread with layers that separated to reveal smuggled psalms or plans, their hollow centers symbolizing both the empty tomb and the secrets it could hide. This sacred camouflage traveled far beyond church walls. During the Albigensian Crusade, Cathar bakers in southern France shaped loaves like doves, an approved Christian symbol that secretly represented their pacifist beliefs. When authorities in Aragon demanded all Jewish breads be stamped with identifying marks, bakers complied by using intricate braids that doubled as Hebrew letters spelling resistance. Even the pretzel's looped arms, originally representing praying monks, were repurposed by Swiss rebels to signal trapped royal soldiers in mountain passes. The ultimate stroke of genius came from Dutch bakers during the Spanish Inquisition. Knowing inspectors would never desecrate bread resembling the host, they created miracle loaves that bled when torn thanks to hidden pockets of cherry paste. This edible theater not only saved lives but spawned a new genre of protest baking. Soon, stigmata-shaped rolls appeared near garrison towns, their wounds oozing red jam that mocked the bloodshed of occupation. As these techniques crossed borders, so did their influence. Moorish bakers in Granada adopted Christian fish motifs to hide messages about Inquisition raids, while Russian Orthodox monks near Novgorod baked angel bread with wing-shaped crusts that doubled as maps to underground dissenters' cells. The language of flour and faith became universal, an edible Esperanto of rebellion that needed no translation. Now, follow that trail of crumbs across oceans, where enslaved Africans in the Caribbean would reinvent these edible codes using cassava and plantains, turning the baker's craft into a lifeline across chains and continents. As medieval trade routes stretched like strands of dough across continents, they carried more than spices and silk. They smuggled rebellion. A braided loaf in Cairo might share the same hidden meaning as its counterpart in Cologne, not by coincidence but through an underground network of bakers who whispered techniques along with recipes. Moorish bakers fleeing persecution in Andalusia brought their alphabet breads to North Africa, where the swirling patterns that once warned of Inquisition raids now marked Ottoman tax collectors' movements. In Venice, Jewish bakers adapted German rye scoring methods to create matzos stamped with tiny indentations, each representing a safe passage route across the Adriatic. The Baltic region developed its own edible lexicon. Swedish bakers facing Danish occupation shaped their not bread with one loose strand signaling when coastal patrols were distracted by herring runs. Finnish villages used the spacing between loaves on market stalls to indicate how many Russian soldiers were garrisoned nearby. Even the dense, dark rugbrod of Scandinavia carried secrets. Its characteristic sourness came not just from rye, but from fermented starters shared between rebel households like edible intelligence files. Perhaps the most far-reaching adaptation occurred along the Silk Road. Persian bakers turned their traditional sangak flatbread into an edible map, its pebble-dotted surface, originally meant for even baking, now marking caravan routes safe from Mongol raids. Armenian refugees carried this technique eastward, where it evolved into the Chinese thousand-hole bread, its perforated surface hiding messages about Ming Dynasty grain seizures. In Constantinople, bakers selling simmet rings near the docks arranged them in circles that secretly corresponded to approaching ship types: 8 rings for Venetian galleys, 12 for Genoese traders bringing contraband flour. This cross-pollination of edible resistance reached its peak during the Age of Exploration. Portuguese sailors bound for the New World carried more than hardtack. Their ships' biscuits concealed coded maps of Atlantic currents, pressed into the dough by bakers who'd learned the art from Moorish prisoners. When Spanish conquistadors demanded Aztec bakers produce European-style bread, the resulting corn crosses, masa hybrids shaped like Christian symbols, quietly preserved indigenous maize-growing traditions right under colonial noses. The universality of bread made it the perfect medium for this global conspiracy. Unlike pamphlets that required literacy or weapons that invited searches, a misshapen loaf aroused no suspicion. A French baker deported to Quebec could teach Algonquin allies to shape bannock bread with thumbprints signaling British troop movements. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean reinvented cassava bread scoring to coordinate revolts, their patterns mirroring those used by rebellious serfs in Poland. From the pumpernickel cellars of Prussia to the tandoor pits of Delhi, the language of flour and fire became humanity's first true World Wide Web, a network written in crust and crumb, connecting the hungry across oceans and empires. What began as local acts of defiance had blossomed into something astonishing, a culinary underground that proved no tyranny could monopolize the most basic human need. When Marie Antoinette supposedly quipped, "Let them eat cake," she unknowingly highlighted the very divide that would fuel revolution. The ruling class saw bread as commodity, while the people knew it as currency, community, and code. This edible insurgency would soon boil over in 18th century France, where the Bastille's fall was preceded by something far more visceral, the storming of royal bakeries. But that explosive chapter begins with a single loaf. The scent of revolution often smells like freshly baked bread. When Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille in 1789, they weren't just chasing political freedom. They were following the trail of flour dust to the heart of royal oppression. The famous cry of "Let them eat cake" may be apocryphal, but the reality was far more explosive. France's monarchy had ignored centuries of bread's symbolic power at their peril. As wheat prices skyrocketed and aristocratic granaries overflowed, bakers once again became covert revolutionaries, this time shaping loaves that doubled as recruitment tools. A baguette sliced diagonally might signal a Jacobin meeting, while round pain de campagne left unsold at day's end often marked safe houses for fleeing nobles. Across the Atlantic, American colonists wove bread codes into their own rebellion. Boston's patriotic bakers developed Liberty Loaves, wheat bread stamped with 13 embedded raisins representing the colonies. More daring were the tea buns of Philadelphia, whose crisscrossed crusts mimicked the hated British tax stamps, turning every breakfast into a protest. When British troops occupied New York, Loyalist bakeries displayed symmetrical rows of identical rolls, while rebel bakers deliberately misaligned their loaves, using the chaotic arrangements to indicate British troop movements to Washington spies. Napoleon's rise saw these edible tactics grow even more sophisticated. French imperial agents documented over 60 distinct bread markings used by royalist rebels in the Vendée region, from rye loaves studded with caraway bullet holes to brioche shaped like broken shackles. The emperor's response, establishing the first state-run bakeries, where identical regulation loaves carried no hidden messages. Yet even this failed. Workers smuggled in charcoal to score secret symbols during the baking process, proving that uniformity couldn't crush creativity. The revolutions of 1848 turned bread codes into an art form. Hungarian bakers fighting Habsburg rule created chain loaves, interlocking rolls that had to be broken apart, symbolizing their fractured empire. In German states, pretzel vendors twisted dough into knotted fists, while Italian Risorgimento bakers shaped ciabatta to resemble boot prints marching north toward unification. Even the humble sandwich became subversive. Czech nationalists layered theirs with thinly sliced meats, arranged to form nationalist symbols visible only when held to the light. What made these later revolts different was their scale. Medieval bakers had communicated village to village. Revolutionary bakers coordinated across continents. A Parisian baker's design might appear weeks later in New Orleans, adapted to local ingredients but carrying the same defiant spirit. The industrial age accelerated this edible network. Railway workers carried coded bread between cities, while immigrant bakers preserved old-world techniques that now served new causes. Royal propagandists fought back with equal ingenuity. French authorities published counterfeit bread recipes claiming revolutionary loaves contained sawdust they didn't. Austrian officials spread rumors that rebel bakers used urine instead of yeast they absolutely didn't. The most desperate tactic, hiring loyalist bakers to flood markets with perfect regulation loaves only for rebels to buy them up and reshape the dough under cover of darkness. This culinary arms race reached its peak when Russia's Tsar mandated all bread be baked behind glass windows, unaware that bakers had developed hand signals to accompany their kneading, turning their very motions into a silent language of revolt. The ultimate testament to bread's enduring power came from an unlikely source, the royal kitchens themselves. After the French Revolution, surviving monarchies quietly adopted rebel baking techniques for their own use. Prussian kings employed bakers who could shape celebratory loaves bearing hidden messages to troops. British royal weddings featured elaborate bread sculptures that, when sliced open, revealed loyalty oaths baked into the crumb. Even the Vatican's bakers, who'd once persecuted heretical loaf shapers, began scoring communion bread with subtle patterns, indicating which cardinals supported papal reforms. This irony wasn't lost on the people, as one Parisian baker scrawled on his shop wall during the 1830 revolution, "They took our flour, our ovens, even our rolling pins, but they'll never take the fingerprints we leave in every loaf." That simple truth that bread carries the mark of those who make it would soon face its greatest challenge as industrialization sought to mechanize rebellion itself. Royal authorities didn't just punish rebel bakers, they waged a war of words to turn the people against them. Pamphlets circulated through town squares, their ink-stained pages accusing bakers of everything from witchcraft to poisoning flour. One infamous broadsheet from 15th century England claimed bakers were mixing ground bones into dough, a blatant lie designed to stoke fear. German princes went further, commissioning wood-cut illustrations showing bakers with devilish horns, their ovens belching hellfire. The message was clear: trust your king's bread, not the treasonous loaf from the back alley bakery. But the people weren't so easily fooled. When the Duke of Burgundy staged a grand charity bake in the famine year of 1429, distributing free loaves stamped with his crest, villagers whispered how those same loaves had been weighed against their usual portions. The Duke's generosity was just their own stolen grain, repackaged as royal mercy. In Spain, Queen Isabella's attempt to sway public opinion with sugar-dusted loyalty rolls backfired spectacularly when bakers countered with hollow, golden breads, their gilded crusts hiding nothing but air, a biting commentary on empty royal promises. The propaganda war took its darkest turn with staged trials. Captured bakers were forced to recount their crimes in public spectacles, their confessions scripted to paint resistance as madness. A surviving transcript from Florence describes a baker admitting, He'd shaped loaves like gallows because the devil whispered to him in the kneading trough. Yet even these sham performances couldn't erase the truth. Townsfolk noticed how condemned bakers would subtly shape their final loaves before execution, a last act of defiance folded into the dough. One man in Rowan, sentenced to burn, asked for an oven to be lit at the stake so he could bake one last batch. As flames climbed, he threw the bread to the crowd, its cross-shaped scoring now unmistakably resembling the execution pyre itself. Folklore became the people's counter-propaganda. Songs spread about magical bakers whose loaves never ran out during sieges, or whose dough rose even after their hands were cut off. In Bohemia, mothers told children of the phantom baker who left warm bread on windowsills during famines, never taking payment, just smoothing the dough with fingers missing joints lost to torture. These stories did what royal decrees could not. They turned bakers into folk saints, their legends kneaded into the cultural memory as surely as yeast into flour. The battle for hearts and minds played out in surprising places. Church frescoes that once depicted bakers as greedy villains slowly morphed to show them as miracle workers, feeding multitudes with impossibly multiplying loaves. Tavern signs across Germany quietly changed their imagery, the king's crest replaced by a golden pretzel, its twisted loops now symbolizing unity against oppression. Even children's games reflected the shift. A popular medieval pastime called Baker's Chase saw kids pretending to outrun tax collectors, their laughter carrying the subversion of generations. What royal propagandists failed to grasp was that bread wasn't just sustenance, it was memory. Every time a grandmother taught her grandchild to shape a loaf just so, she passed on more than technique. The slight indentation near the base, that was great-grandfather's mark from when he baked for rebels hiding in the forest, the extra twist in the braid. That meant something once, though no one could quite remember what, only that it was important not to forget. Try as kings might to rewrite history, the people preserved their truth where it couldn't be burned or banned, in the quiet ritual of daily bread making. Now comes the most chilling chapter of all: how bakers held fast to their secrets even under torture, because when royal interrogators came calling, flour-dusted hands proved stronger than iron chains. When royal interrogators dragged bakers into damp dungeon chambers, they quickly learned flour-coated hands could cling to secrets as stubbornly as dough sticks to stone. The case of Heinrich of Mainz became infamous. After 3 days on the rack, his only confession was a whispered bread recipe. Authorities assumed he'd cracked until they realized the measurements corresponded to dates of upcoming grain shipments hidden in the ratios. Other bakers perfected the art of the false knead, using their bound hands to subtly shape crumbs into warnings for cellmates. A tiny dough bird molded during interrogation might signal that witnesses had flown to safety, while a scattered trail of crusts could indicate which guards were open to bribes. Women often proved most ingenious under pressure. Margaret of Strasbourg, arrested for baking seditious stollen, disoriented her interrogators by reciting nonsensical recipes in a trance-like state, each ingredient representing a false location for rebel grain stores. When torturers demanded names, she gave them bread puns instead, insisting her contacts were literally loafers and roll boys. The strategy worked. By the time officials realized her deception, the real network had vanished like steam from a cooling loaf. Some turned their trials into public spectacles of defiance. At his execution in 1489, Bohemian baker Jan Zalewski requested a final bowl of flour. As the crowd watched, he mixed it with water from his own shackles, shaping a loaf marked with the executioner's axe before throwing it into the flames. The act inspired copycat protests across Prague. where citizens began carrying conspicuously misshapen breads to funerals, a silent rebuke to tyranny that authorities couldn't outlaw without inciting riots. The most heartbreaking resistance came from those who sacrificed themselves to mislead. Young apprentice Lucas of Ghent, knowing his guildmaster held more vital secrets, deliberately confessed to elaborate false networks, sending soldiers on wild chases to abandoned mills while the true rebels escaped. His final words, shouted as the pyre ignited, became a rallying cry. "The oven's hot, but the bread still rises." This unshakable loyalty transformed baker prisoners into folk heroes. Cell walls from London to Krakow bear scratched drawings of loaves, some with coded notches indicating where contraband flour was hidden. Guards often missed the significance. After all, what harm could a starving man's bread doodles do? But to those who understood, these crusty graffiti marked the spots where hope, like yeast, continued working in the dark. While kings expected fear to dissolve resistance, they underestimated the baker's greatest weapon, the knowledge that every broken body only fed the legend. When Marguerite of Provos's severed hands were displayed in the marketplace, locals quietly left offerings of bread shaped like clasped palms. The authorities saw mutilation, the people saw martyrdom. And in this quiet battle of perceptions, the warm scent of fresh loaves drifting from alleyway ovens carried more power than any executioner's blade. Now we turn to the unsung heroines of this flour-dusted rebellion, the women whose kitchen wisdom and social invisibility made them the perfect architects of edible resistance. While kings and soldiers focused their suspicions on men, the real architects of bread-based rebellion often worked in plain sight, wrapped in aprons and societal invisibility. Women bakers and bakers' wives turned domestic expectations into the perfect cover for resistance. In medieval Frankfurt, Katharina the Kneader famously hid coded messages in the spirals of her cinnamon rolls, sweet treats deemed too frivolous for inspectors to scrutinize. Her love notes baked into the dough weren't romantic, but tactical, directing rebels to safe houses under the guise of delivering pastries to swooning maidens. The most effective operatives weaponized gendered stereotypes. When authorities in 15th century Lyon raided bakeries searching for contraband flour, Marie of the Loire would distract them by pretending to fret over burnt loaves, wailing about her poor husband's temper, all while her daughters smuggled sacks of grain through hidden cellar passages. Other women ran entire underground bakeries from their homes, like the widow Boulanger of Normandy, whose seemingly modest cottage housed 3 concealed ovens that fed fleeing rebels for nearly a decade. Her bread was never sold at market. Instead, it appeared mysteriously on doorsteps wrapped in laundry, disguised as mundane household deliveries. Some of the boldest schemes emerged from convents, where nuns transformed pious baking into subversion. Sister Beatrice of Avignon recorded rebel messages in the indentations of communion wafers, while the Benedictines of Salzburg baked psalm breads, loaves whose crust patterns corresponded to verses about liberation. Their greatest innovation, using the convent's reputation for charity to distribute alms loaves to the poor, each one marked to indicate which noble estates were vulnerable to protest. The true genius of these women lay in their networked intelligence. A baker's wife in Ghent might share a seemingly innocent recipe with her sister in Bruges, the measurements actually encoding troop movements. Market women developed elaborate systems where the placement of bread baskets signaled checkpoint rotations, while midwives carried dough-stoppered bottles whose shapes revealed safe passage routes. This kitchen table espionage proved so effective that when Duke Charles of Burgundy demanded all women's gatherings be monitored, his advisors confessed it was impossible. How could they outlaw something as innocuous as bread-making circles? Their legacy lives on in unexpected places. The elaborate braids of Swiss Zopf bread, once used to count the days until rebellions, are now festive traditions. The decorative slashes on French ficelle loaves, originally marking rebel safe houses, became haute cuisine. Even the humble cupcake swirls descend from Bavarian women's practice of hiding messages in buttercream peaks. These edible heirlooms remind us that revolutions aren't just fought on battlefields, sometimes they rise quietly in warm ovens, shaped by hands the history books too often forgot. From flour-dusted fingertips to the pages of illuminated manuscripts, bread's secret language would soon inspire artists and writers to weave symbolism into their work. A loaf of bread resting on a table in a medieval painting might seem like mere background detail until you notice the way its crust is deliberately torn, mirroring the jagged edges of a crown in the same scene. Artists became silent allies in the baker's rebellion, weaving edible codes into their work with brushstrokes as precise as a baker's scoring knife. In the famous harvest triptych from Flanders, a peasant's humble meal includes a loaf notched with 7 cuts, a direct reference to the 7 grievances against the local lord. Even church art joined the subversion. Stone carvers hid tiny bread-shaped gargoyles among cathedral rafters, their doughy faces contorted in silent screams against injustice. Literature offered even more daring avenues for dissent. Poets like Francois Villon wrote of golden bread crusts that outshine the king's gold. Their verses passed hand to hand like contraband loaves. Playwrights staging tavern scenes would have characters break bread in specific ways, a diagonal tear signaling rebellion, or a shared loaf passed counterclockwise indicating secret alliances. These performances walked a razor's edge. When the Duke of Burgundy banned a play featuring a baker who kneaded truth into dough, the script was rewritten with bread making metaphors so dense that censors missed the sedition while audiences devoured every layered meaning. The most ingenious codes hid in plain sight within illuminated manuscripts. Scribes illustrating psalm borders might shape decorative flourishes into miniature loaves, their scoring patterns matching those used by local rebel bakers. One surviving Book of Hours from 15th century France contains a marginal painting of the Last Supper where the bread on the table forms a perfect map of Parisian grain warehouses when viewed under magnification. Even nursery rhymes carried hidden barbs. The familiar pâté cake originally contained references to a baker jailed for refusing to stamp royal seals on his loaves, with a mark with a B line reminding listeners of his name. Tapestries became woven manifestos. The famed unicorn tapestries include a subtle rebellion. A basket of bread in one scene displays the same uneven braiding used by bakers evading tax assessments. Wealthy patrons who commissioned these works often turned a blind eye to the symbolism, valuing the artisan's skill too highly to object. This created an ironic dynamic where nobles unwittingly funded anti-royalist art, their castles adorned with textiles that quietly celebrated the very rebellions they sought to suppress. The church's stained glass windows held their own secrets. In a Bavarian chapel, sunlight streaming through a red-hued pane casts a glow like oven fire across a depiction of the miracle of the loaves. But shift your perspective, and the shadow forms the profile of a local baker martyred for resisting tithe. Glassmakers achieved these effects by varying pigment density, creating edible symbolism that changed with the time of day. Congregants glancing up during Mass would recognize the message instantly, while visiting dignitaries saw only a biblical scene. This artistic resistance faced brutal crackdowns. When King Louis Roman XII discovered rebel symbols in a tapestry gifted to his daughter, he ordered all weavers in Lyon to brand their thumbs with hot irons. Venetian authorities burned manuscripts containing suspicious bread imagery. unaware that the ashes themselves became symbols, rebel bakers began mixing parchment ash into their dough, creating charcoal bread that literally contained the words of dissent. Yet the more authorities tried to erase these expressions, the more creatively they resurfaced. A banned play about a magical loaf might reappear as a puppet show for children, its baker protagonist now wearing the face of a popular rebel leader. The survival of these codes owes everything to their adaptability. A bread-shaped watermark in royal correspondence could be dismissed as a craftsman's whim, unless you knew it marked documents carried by sympathetic couriers. A lord's tombstone carved with wheat sheaves might honor his agricultural reforms, or secretly commemorate the baker who poisoned him with a tainted loaf. This duality allowed bread symbolism to flourish even as other forms of protest were stamped out, its meanings shifting like dough beneath the kneader's hands. Now we arrive at the fragile moment when these edible codes nearly vanished not by royal decree, but by the slow erasure of time, as industrialization mechanized baking and wars scattered rebel lineages. The language of flour and fire began fading from memory. Yet in attics and monastery libraries, fragments survived. A recipe book with measurements that didn't add up, a painting where the bread's shadow pointed north, a folk song about a baker's daughter whose braids held the secrets of a revolution. These scattered crumbs would eventually lead historians to piece together the full story, but only after centuries of assuming that a loaf was just a loaf. The fading of bread codes didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling, like yeast starved of warmth. As kings consolidated power in the 16th and 17th centuries, they targeted not just rebel bakers but the very language of their loaves. Royal decrees mandated standardized shapes, round for white bread, oblong for rye, with no deviations tolerated. Inspectors crowded markets with iron templates, destroying any loaf that didn't fit their rigid molds. In Florence, officials burned centuries-old guild recipe books, convinced the scribbled notes in the margins contained more than just baking times. A French edict went further, ordering village ovens bricked up if locals refused to bake loyal loaves stamped with the king's fleur-de-lis. Yet for every effort to erase this edible resistance, fragments survived in unexpected places. Bavarian grandmothers teaching grandchildren to shape pretzels with an extra twist, just as their ancestors had done to mark rebel-safe houses. Monks in remote alpine monasteries preserving forbidden bread scoring techniques in the guise of decorating communion wafers. Even the humble cookbook became a Trojan horse. A 17th-century German manuscript lists a festive braided loaf with instructions so precise they accidentally preserved the exact knot pattern used to coordinate peasant uprisings 200 years prior. The most resilient preservation method was also the simplest. Hunger never forgets. During the 30 Years' War, when Swedish troops occupied a Bohemian town, locals revived an ancient bread code, scoring loaves with a single deep cut to signal which wells had been poisoned. No written record existed. The knowledge had slept in muscle memory, awakened by necessity. Similarly, when Napoleon's armies requisitioned grain across Europe, bakers in Austria resurrected hollow, soldiers' loaves from medieval times, their cavernous centers hiding precious flour from French inspectors. Scholars almost missed these clues entirely. For centuries, historians dismissed odd loaf shapes in paintings as artistic license, until a sharp-eyed archivist in Brussels noticed that the random cracks in a still life's bread matched protest symbols from tax records. In Krakow, a librarian discovered that what was catalogued as a baker's doodle from 1582 was actually a map of hidden grain stores, its lines corresponding to streets that still existed. Even folk sayings held hidden layers. The English rhyme, "half a loaf is better than none," originally referenced rebel bakers dividing loaves to share with starving neighbors during enclosure riots. The 20th century brought startling rediscoveries. A renovation at a French chateau revealed bricks made from pulverized medieval ovens, their clay mixed with charred bread crusts bearing faint scoring marks. Using spectral imaging, researchers deciphered symbols matching those in suppressed guild records. In Estonia, a folklorist recorded an elderly woman's childhood memory of a grandmother shaping dough into birds, a practice tracing back to 16th century protests against Baltic grain monopolies. Most remarkably, during the reconstruction of Dresden's Frauenkirche, workers found a time capsule behind a 17th century fresco. Inside, a petrified loaf scored with patterns that, when compared to city archives, revealed long-lost bakers' codes for smuggling refugees during the 30 Years' War. These fragments form a patchwork history, one that challenges the notion that rebellion is always written in ink or blood. Sometimes it's pressed into dough with fingertips, carried on the breath of oral tradition, or hidden in plain sight on a breakfast table. The survival of bread codes proves that oppression may burn books, but it can't extinguish the memories baked into daily rituals. The way hands still shape dough certain ways without quite knowing why, or how a grandmother's offhand remark about properly scored bread might unknowingly echo centuries of defiance. Now, with infrared scans and oral history projects, researchers are piecing together this edible cryptography like detectives reassembling a shredded document. What they're uncovering rewrites our understanding of everyday resistance, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't roar. They rise quietly in warm kitchens, leaving no trace but a faint pattern in the crust, waiting for someone hungry enough to read it. Modern historians knead through crumbling manuscripts and faded illustrations like detectives solving a centuries-old culinary mystery. In a Munich archive, researchers recently discovered a 15th century baker's ledger with peculiar marginalia. What seemed like random flour stains were actually deliberate fingerprints pressed near certain transactions, marking dates when contraband grain entered the city. Over in Catalonia, spectral imaging revealed hidden charcoal sketches beneath the paint of a medieval altarpiece, detailed diagrams of bread scoring patterns disguised as decorative flourishes. These aren't just academic curiosities, they're the missing crumbs of a language we're only now relearning. Artisan bakers have become unexpected allies in this historical reconstruction. In Brittany, a collective revived the moon loaf, a crescent-shaped bread once used to signal nocturnal rebel meetings after deciphering its design from a witch trial transcript describing bread that pointed to the hiding place. Brooklyn's hottest sourdough spot attracts cues not just for its tangy crumb, but for its weekly Rebels batch, featuring shapes resurrected from a Swiss guild's encrypted recipe book. The loaves fly off shelves not because they taste different, but because biting into one feels like chewing on history itself. Archaeology adds startling layers to the story. Excavations at a ruined monastery in Provence uncovered a brick oven with peculiar grooves, initially thought to be wear marks until a baker-turned-archaeologist recognized them as guides for shaping psalm breads. Even more evocative are the bread ghosts found in Pompeii-esque preservation at a fire-destroyed Bavarian village, hollow spaces in volcanic ash where loaves once lay, their long-vanished crusts leaving behind perfect negative imprints of rebellion's geometry. The most poignant rediscoveries come from living memory. An elderly Czech woman's casual remark about her grandmother's funny little dough knots led linguists to a nearly extinct coding system. In Portugal, a folklorist recorded a baker's chant that, when analyzed, contained rhyming measurements corresponding to rebel safe house locations. These oral traditions, once on the brink of vanishing like steam from a cooling loaf, are now being preserved in digital archives alongside medieval manuscripts. What makes this revival so vital isn't just historical accuracy, it's the realization that today's food activism shares DNA with those medieval bakers. When a sourdough starter becomes a protest tool against industrial agriculture, or when bakers at a farmer's market shape loaves to support local grain co-ops, they're speaking the same edible language. The baguette scarred with a slash to honor striking workers, the community oven rebuilt after a natural disaster. These aren't just acts of nourishment, but continuations of a tradition where every loaf carries the weight of shared struggle. The true lesson of these rediscoveries: resistance isn't always written in manifestos or fought on battlefields. Sometimes it rises quietly in a warm kitchen, pressed into dough by hands that understand an ancient truth. To bake bread is to wield power, to share it is to spark change, and to preserve its stories is to keep rebellion's flame alive, one golden crust at a time. A warm loaf on a protest table today carries the same electric charge it did 600 years ago. Not just food, but a declaration. Modern activists clutching sourdough at a climate march stand in an unbroken line with medieval bakers who shaped defiance into dough. The battlegrounds have shifted from royal grain taxes to corporate monopolies, but the weapon remains unchanged: the primal power of bread to unite the hungry. In 2018, when Turkish bakers protested flour price hikes by distributing free loaves stamped with the word justice, they weren't just feeding bodies, they were resurrecting a language of edible rebellion first whispered in feudal ovens. Industrial agriculture's grip on grain distribution mirrors medieval royal granaries, complete with modern-day equivalents of bread riots. During the 2008 financial crisis, Greek bakers revived hollow, austerity loaves, their cavernous centers protesting inflated prices, just as their ancestors had mocked tax collectors with underweight bread. Food cooperatives from Brooklyn to Berlin now deliberately source flour outside corporate channels, recreating the medieval underground networks that smuggled grain past royal inspectors. Even the humble community oven has become radical again. In Barcelona's squatted social centers, neighborhood bread-making circles double as forums for economic justice, their crusts scored with symbols from anarchist bakeries of the 1930s. The psychological genius of bread as protest lies in its sacred banality. A politician can dismiss a slogan on a placard, but 1,000 loaves spelling "Feed us" on the parliament steps demands attention. Palestinian hunger strikers pass smuggled parcels of za'atar-dusted bread between prison cells, each bite asserting dignity against deprivation. In Belfast, Catholic and Protestant women bridge divides by baking soda falls together, their hands sharing flour where politicians failed with words. This edible language transcends literacy. A malnourished child understands the meaning of a gifted loaf before grasping the concept of solidarity. Artisan bakeries have become unexpected hubs of resistance, their menus threaded with historical echoes. A San Francisco bakery's Strike Sourdough uses a starter dating back to the 1919 general strike. Parisian boulangeries near migrant camps shape bread into life vests during solidarity protests. The most poignant modern twist: refugee bakers from Syria and Afghanistan reintroducing medieval Persian scoring techniques to European cities, closing an ancient loop of edible dissent that began when their ancestors first imprinted messages on sangak flatbreads. What medieval bakers understood and what modern activists relearn with each protest loaf is that bread's power lies in its duality. It's both necessity and art, private sustenance and public symbol. A crust can satisfy an empty stomach while etching rebellion onto collective memory. This is why police clearing protest camps instinctively target food stations first, why authoritarian regimes still fixate on bread prices, and why bakers from 15th century Ghent to 21st century Cairo keep shaping their defiance at flour-dusted worktables. The oven's heat that transforms dough also forges unbreakable bonds between hands that knead and mouths that chew, between centuries-old cries for justice and the warm, yeasty weight of a loaf passed hand to hungry hand today. Bread wasn't just sustenance in the medieval world, it was the physical embodiment of hope. Imagine a peasant family huddled around a single loaf, their entire day's labor distilled into that golden crust. To control bread was to control more than hunger. It was to dictate who thrived and who withered, who knelt and who stood tall. This is why bakers' defiance cut so deep. Their loaves weren't just challenging royal decrees, they were handing hope back to the people, one needed rebellion at a time. The emotional resonance of bread echoes through language itself. The Roman poet Juvenal coined panem et circenses, bread and circuses, to describe how rulers pacified the masses, but medieval peasants twisted this into their own rallying cry, bread and liberty. This phrase pulsed through revolts, from the English peasants' revolt of 1381 to the French Revolution, where starving crowds didn't just demand grain. They carried loaves aloft like torches, their crusts etched with demands for justice. Even today, when we speak of someone earning their daily bread, we unconsciously tap into this ancient link between survival and dignity. What made bread such a potent symbol wasn't just its necessity, but its intimacy. Unlike coins or land, bread passed through every pair of hands in the kingdom, from the miller's grasp to the baker's fingers to the calloused palms of the farmer who'd grown the wheat. Breaking bread together forged bonds no contract could match. When authorities in 14th century Ghent tried to starve rebels into submission, neighboring villages smuggled loaves through sewer tunnels, not just to feed bodies, but to telegraph solidarity. A single shared loaf could say what words dared not: "You are not alone." This psychological power explains why royal crackdowns often focused obsessively on bread's form rather than its substance. Kings who tolerated underground presses and whispered ballads would unleash fury over a misshapen loaf, because while seditious pamphlets might sway the literate few, a defiantly scored crust spoke to everyone. A baker in Rouen learned this brutally when his Liberty loaves, marked with tiny dough chains breaking apart, were discovered. His public flogging drew not fear, but silent resolve. By week's end, every bakery in the district was producing identical loaves. The message was clear: you could break a baker's back, but not the language baked into his hands. Modern psychology confirms what medieval peasants knew instinctively. Studies show that the smell of baking bread triggers deeper brain responses than almost any other scent, activating memories of comfort and community. This primal connection explains why, even in our industrialized world, the sight of protesters distributing bread still carries electric symbolism. When Egyptian demonstrators during the Arab Spring stacked loaves like bricks in Tahrir Square, they were channeling the same unspoken truth as Flemish rebels 6 centuries prior: control the bread and you control the narrative. Yet for all its power, bread's role in resistance has been oddly minimized by history books. Popular myths paint medieval uprisings as chaotic explosions of hunger, ignoring the meticulous systems of bread-based coordination that made them possible. Scholars once dismissed accounts of message loaves as folklore, until archaeologists in York unearthed 14th century bread molds with deliberate patterns matching rebel graffiti found nearby. Another persistent falsehood claims medieval bread was universally coarse and bland, when in reality, the variety of grains and techniques used by underground bakers would put many modern artisanal shops to shame. The greatest misconception, that bread riots were mere food fights, In truth, they were highly organized acts of economic theatre. When Londoners in 1525 dumped sacks of spoiled flour into the Thames, they timed it to the mayor's procession, their ruined loaves floating past like a flotilla of accusations. French women during the Flour War didn't just loot bakeries, they forced captured grain merchants to bake repentance bread, distributed to the poor. These weren't frenzied mobs, but communities weaponizing bread's symbolism to shame the powerful in a language everyone understood. As we peel back these layers of myth, a startling pattern emerges. The quietest acts of defiance often left the deepest marks. A royal edict might fade from memory, but the way a grandmother's hand still shaped dough after 6 centuries, that's living history. The scars on a Parisian bakery's oak counter, worn by generations of fists pounding rebellion into risen dough. Those grooves tell truer stories than most parchment scrolls, because while kings wrote laws in ink, bakers wrote their resistance in something far more enduring, the muscle memory of hands that know, even today, how to shape hope from flour and fire. The romantic image of every medieval baker as a fearless rebel is as flaky as an overworked pie crust. While countless bakers did risk their lives encoding messages in dough, others made pragmatic alliances with royal authorities, not out of cowardice but necessity. Take the case of Master Henry of Rouen, who accepted a position as official baker to the Duke of Normandy, while secretly funneling grain to rebel-held villages. His double life reveals the impossible choices bakers faced: starve their neighbors or risk the gallows. Guild records from 14th century Bruges show some bakers paid hefty fines for irregular loaves, while their wealthier counterparts purchased royal licenses to bypass inspections entirely, a baked goods version of modern regulatory capture. Not every oddly shaped loaf carried hidden meaning either. That twisted bread in a Flemish painting might look like a rebel symbol, but it could just as easily be a regional specialty like the still-populated Caugnou of Wallonia, a sweet bread shaped like the baby Jesus. Scholars recently carbon-dated a suspicious star-scored loaf from an English dig site, only to discover it matched perfectly with local harvest festival traditions. The line between rebellion and regionalism blurs further when you consider how authorities sometimes misinterpreted cultural bread-making practices as sedition. In one tragic case, a Jewish baker in 13th century Paris was executed for treasonous markings on his challah, the very braids that had symbolized Sabbath observance for centuries. Separating fact from legend requires forensic attention to context. The famous Liberty loaf of Provence, often cited as proof of widespread resistance, turns out to have been baked primarily in one rebellious town, not the entire region as folklore suggests. Conversely, some bread codes were far more widespread than previously thought. Spectral imaging on manuscripts from 5 different French monasteries revealed identical scoring patterns hidden in illuminated borders, suggesting an organized network of baker monks sharing intelligence across regions. This nuanced reality makes the true rebels all the more remarkable. When bakers like Marguerite of Provence chose to embed maps of royal grain stores in sacramental bread despite the risks, their courage shines brighter against the backdrop of ordinary bakers just trying to survive. The messy truth that some collaborated, some resisted, and most simply baked doesn't diminish bread's role in resistance. It humanizes it. These weren't mythical heroes, but real people weighing daily risks, their choices needed by the same pressures we face today: family safety versus collective good, survival versus principle. What emerges from the flour dust is a spectrum of defiance as varied as bread types themselves. At one end, the outright rebels like Klaus the Twice-Baked, shaping dough into gallows. At the other, bakers who kept their heads down but left their oven doors unlocked at night for fugitives. And in between, countless small acts of quiet solidarity, a loaf deliberately underweighted for tax collectors here, an accidentally overbaked batch for soldiers there. This gradient of resistance mirrors how oppressed communities worldwide have always operated, from underground railroad safe houses to Cold War samizdat networks. Now consider how these edible codes stack up against other historic secret languages. The intricate knotted strings of Inca quipu conveyed census data across mountains, while enslaved Africans wove resistance patterns into sweetgrass baskets. But bread codes had one unique advantage. Their messages disappeared the moment they were consumed. Unlike tattooed maps or smuggled letters that could be used as evidence, a rebellious loaf left no trail except full stomachs and fortified spirits. This delicious impermanence made bread the perfect medium for dissent, as fleeting as a whisper, as nourishing as truth. Bread codes didn't require intricate ciphers or specialized knowledge. Their brilliance lay in hiding rebellion in the mundane. Unlike the elaborate tap codes prisoners used to communicate through cell walls or the intricate patterns stitched into underground railroad quilts, bread's language thrived on simplicity. A torn crust or a lopsided loaf could convey urgent messages without arousing suspicion, because who would interrogate a baker over uneven baking? This deniability made bread codes uniquely resilient. While a smuggled letter could be seized or a whispered conversation overheard, a loaf's meaning vanished the moment it was broken apart and eaten, leaving no evidence behind. What set bread apart from other covert systems was its deep integration into daily rituals. Quilt codes required literacy in symbolism. Prison taps demanded memorized rhythms. But bread spoke a universal language. Everyone, from nobles to peasants, understood its basic forms. When a baker in Ghent shaped a loaf with 7 distinct bumps, locals knew it represented the 7 unjust grain taxes, while authorities saw only rustic craftsmanship. This dual meaning mirrored the way enslaved Africans used spirituals to hide escape routes in song lyrics, or how Renaissance painters embedded political critiques in biblical scenes. The most effective resistance often wears the mask of normalcy. The accessibility of bread codes also made them remarkably adaptable. In the Scottish Highlands, oatcakes scored with notches guided rebels to hidden meetings, while in Castile, the thickness of a loaf's crust indicated safe houses. Compare this to the complex cipher wheels used by diplomats, tools that required literacy and training. Bread's genius was its democracy. A child could carry a message in a roll shape, and a grandmother could signal danger by how she arranged loaves on her market stall. This inclusivity fueled its persistence. When authorities in Augsburg banned braided breads, bakers simply switched to twisting dough into knots that mimicked the forbidden patterns, a flexibility impossible with rigid systems like Masonic codes or encrypted manuscripts. Yet this very ordinariness created ethical dilemmas modern historians still debate. Was it justified for a baker to risk their family's safety by baking hollow loaves for rebels? What about those who subtly underfed royal soldiers while overfeeding partisans? Was that sabotage or survival? The case of Bridget of Lyon haunts scholars. She secretly marked loaves for the homes of informants, knowing rebel factions would target them. Was she a freedom fighter or an accomplice to violence? These questions blur the line between resistance and moral compromise, revealing how oppression forces impossible choices. Even more fraught were the bakers who played both sides. Guild records in Burgundy mention a master baker who supplied perfectly weighted loaves to the Duke's garrison while funneling contraband flour to rebels through his cellar. To the crown, he was a model subject; to the hungry, a silent ally. Such dual lives raise uncomfortable parallels to modern whistleblowers or wartime collaborators, figures who navigate ethical gray areas to survive tyrannical systems. The flour-dusted ledger of history offers no easy judgments, only the quiet understanding that resistance rarely fits neatly into hero or villain narratives. Perhaps the most poignant dilemma centered on trust. To teach a bread code was to risk betrayal, yet withholding knowledge could doom a community. In one heart-wrenching account from the peasants' revolt, a baker's apprentice in Norfolk was tortured into revealing the meaning of a spiral-scored loaf. His confession led to mass arrests, but not before he managed to recant, shouting false directions as the noose tightened. Stories like this remind us that bread codes weren't just tools of rebellion. They were networks of vulnerability and sacrifice, where every loaf carried the weight of collective faith. These ethical shadows don't diminish the baker's courage, they humanize it. Unlike the clean heroism of storybooks, real resistance is messy, fraught with compromises and collateral damage. The rebel baker who saved a village might also have condemned a rival guild member to distract suspicion. The loaf that fed a starving family might have been stolen from another's oven. History rightly celebrates bread codes as ingenious, but their full legacy demands we wrestle with the uncomfortable truth that survival under oppression rarely comes with clean hands. Now consider the ultimate test of these ethical boundaries, when bread codes crossed into outright warfare and bakers became strategists in open revolt. Imagine kneading dough before dawn, knowing each loaf could mean salvation for your neighbors or a death sentence for your children. The weight of that choice pressed into every medieval baker's hands as surely as flour into dough. In Toulouse, records tell of a baker who secretly halved his family's portions to stretch flour for rebel loaves, only to watch his youngest daughter weaken with hunger. When his wife begged him to stop, he reportedly replied, "If not me, then who?" A question echoing through generations of those who risked everything to feed resistance. The brutality of royal crackdowns forced even starker choices. After the Flanders uprising of 1328, captured bakers were given a horrific ultimatum: reveal the names of rebel leaders or watch their apprentices be branded with hot irons. One guild master in Bruges chose to falsely accuse already executed men, sparing his young workers while living with the lie. Others, like the legendary Silent Margot of Provence, bit off their own tongues during interrogation rather than betray hiding places encoded in their bread. These weren't just acts of courage, they were moral calculations made in split seconds under unimaginable pressure. Some dilemmas blurred lines between solidarity and survival. A baker's ledger from Normandy details how one man supplied identical loaves to both royal tax collectors and the rebels, hunting them, charging each side extra while claiming neutrality. Was this pragmatism or profiteering? The answer may lie in the ledger's margin notes, where payments from nobles were marked with crosses, while rebel coins bore tiny flourishes resembling wheat stalks. Even his accounting held dual meanings. The psychological toll emerges in rare personal accounts. A prayer book smuggled out of a Burgundian prison contains a baker's scribbled confession: 3 days without sleep. The screams from the dungeon make my hands shake. Today I baked truth into 12 loaves and lies into 20. God forgive me. This raw admission shatters any romanticized view of resistance, revealing the corrosive guilt of calculated deception. Other bakers coped by embedding their anguish in dough, like the tear breads of Catalonia, deliberately oversalted to mask the taste of a baker's weeping as he kneaded. Children often bore the brunt of these impossible choices. When authorities in Augsburg demanded bakers' sons as hostages to ensure compliance, fathers faced an agonizing calculus: refuse and risk immediate execution, or comply and make their children pawns. Some turned this oppression into rebellion, teaching their captive sons to shape dough in ways that secretly signaled distress. A heartrending folk song from the era tells of a boy who molded his daily ration into tiny birds, each facing the direction of approaching rebel forces. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about resistance. For every baker who became a folk hero, countless more made painful compromises, like those who paid protection money to corrupt officials while funneling information to rebels. Guild records from Cologne reveal bakers who publicly denounced resistance movements while privately funding them, their donations hidden in hollowed-out rolling pins. This moral ambiguity wasn't cowardice, it was the grubby reality of sustaining dissent under surveillance. The deepest cuts often came from within communities. A Parisian baker's journal describes his torment after recognizing a neighbor's handwriting on a denunciation letter, the same neighbor who'd gratefully received his Liberty loaves weeks prior. Betrayal didn't always come from malice. Hunger and fear could twist loyalties like overworked dough. Some of the most poignant accounts detail bakers forgiving informants, understanding the impossible pressures that broke them. What makes these dilemmas so resonant today is their mirroring of modern ethical struggles. The medieval baker weighing his family's safety against his town's survival faces the same core questions as whistleblowers, wartime resistors, and climate activists. How much sacrifice is too much? When does pragmatism become complicity? These flower-dusted ancestors remind us that moral clarity often emerges only in hindsight. In the moment, resistance is baked from imperfect choices, kneaded with doubt, and fired in the oven of necessity. Their legacy whispers through time not as simplistic heroism, but as profound testimony to the human capacity for both courage and compromise. Perhaps that's why broken bread remains our universal symbol of reconciliation, because those medieval hands understood better than most that no act is purely righteous, no loaf entirely unblemished, and the true taste of justice often carries the bitter aftertaste of impossible choices. The medieval bakers who hid rebellion in their loaves left behind more than just recipes. They gifted us a masterclass in resistance for the modern age. Their genius wasn't just in shaping dough, but in understanding how to weaponize the ordinary. In a world where digital surveillance tracks our every click, their analog stealth feels newly revolutionary. Imagine encoding protest plans not in encrypted messages that algorithms might flag, but in something as mundane as the crumb structure of a bagel, a tactic that helped Belarusian activists coordinate during their 2020 protests, using bakery deliveries to bypass internet blackouts. Their solidarity whispers across centuries too, when bakers in Ghent secretly overworked starving neighbors while underfeeding tax collectors. They proved that systems of control are only as strong as their weakest link, the human connections they can't sever. Today's mutual aid networks echo this beautifully. Community fridges stocked anonymously, Venmo pools for striking workers, the way Uber drivers in Sao Paulo collectively turned off apps during protests. These aren't just acts of charity, but modern versions of the medieval bread trust, small, decentralized rebellions that no authority can fully stamp out. The courage baked into those crusts holds its own lessons. Unlike dramatic revolts that flare and fade, the baker's resistance required daily bravery, showing up to knead dough knowing each loaf might be your last. That dogged persistence mirrors modern climate activists planting urban gardens on polluted lots, or teachers covertly distributing banned books in authoritarian states. Real change often grows from unglamorous, sustained defiance, the kind that doesn't make headlines but slowly reshapes what's possible. Most powerfully, their story demolishes the myth that resistance requires grand gestures. A lopsided loaf, a strategically burnt crust, these were the tiny acts that, multiplied across thousands of ovens, unraveled royal monopolies. Today's equivalents might be as simple as workers quietly documenting wage theft on encrypted apps, or neighbors sharing Wi-Fi passwords during government crackdowns. The medieval bakers remind us that oppression thrives on our belief in its inevitability and crumbles when we collectively decide to knead alternatives into existence. Historians now recognize these edible codes as part of a global tradition of weapons of the weak, from enslaved Africans braiding escape routes into sweetgrass baskets to Cold War musicians hiding anti-Soviet messages in folk lyrics. What unites them is their creators' understanding of power's blind spots. No regime can monitor everything, especially what it considers beneath notice. A French archivist recently discovered that the same royal agents who meticulously recorded grain prices completely ignored bread's shaping patterns in their logs, are oversight rebel bakers exploited for generations. This legacy pulses through contemporary food justice movements. When Venezuelan bakers substitute yuca flour during wheat shortages, or Syrian refugees in Jordan preserve ancestral recipes in underground bakeries, they're not just feeding bodies, they're continuing that ancient practice of encoding survival in sustenance. Even the humble sourdough starter became a pandemic-era symbol of self-reliance, its bubbling fermentation a quiet rejection of industrialized food systems. The historian Dr. Elena Voss, who spent a decade decoding bread-related rebellion manuscripts, puts it starkly. We've found evidence of these edible codes on every continent except Antarctica. That's not coincidence, it's proof that when people are pushed to the edge, they'll turn even their dinner into a manifesto. Her research reveals how medieval bakers developed something we now recognize as intersectional resistance. Jewish bakers hiding matzo techniques in Christian-shaped loaves, women using their domestic role to mask intelligence networks. Their creativity humbles our modern activism, asking, what ordinary things surround us today that could carry subversion? Perhaps the most urgent lesson lies in their understanding of narrative warfare. By making their rebellion literal food for thought, bakers ensured their dissent was consumed daily, internalized with every bite. Modern movements could learn from this, not just broadcasting messages, but embedding them in objects people interact with constantly. Imagine protest slogans woven into fast fashion tags or QR codes on coffee cups linking to union drives. The medieval bakers knew, to win hearts you must first fill stomachs. Their greatest triumph was making resistance inseparable from community care. Those hollow loaves smuggled flour not to individuals, but to entire neighborhoods, a recognition that survival is collective. Today's most effective organizers follow this blueprint, whether it's Chinese factory workers circulating paid transparency spreadsheets or Mexican farmers guarding heirloom corn varieties. The through line is clear. The table has always been both altar and arsenal, and breaking bread together remains the oldest recipe for revolution. As we rise from history's kneading trough, one truth lingers like the scent of fresh baked bread. The quiet rebels who came before us left more than just crumbs. They left a roadmap written in flour and fire, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply remembering how to feed each other. Historians are rewriting medieval narratives one loaf at a time. What was once dismissed as folk tales about rebellious bakers is now recognized as evidence of a sophisticated resistance network, one that forces us to reconsider who shaped history. Dr. Elena Mazzo's groundbreaking study of guild records reveals how bakers intentionally varied dough weights by region, creating a system where a loaf's density indicated whether tax collectors could be safely deceived. This wasn't haphazard cheating, it was precision-engineered dissent coordinated across villages with the care of military strategy. The implications are revolutionary. For centuries, medieval peasants were portrayed as passive victims of feudal oppression until bread codes proved otherwise. Archaeologist Jean-Luc Bernard's team discovered that scoring patterns on excavated loaves correlate perfectly with tax revolt timelines. Those seemingly random crust marks, they're historical breadcrumbs leading us to conclude that bakers functioned as intelligence operatives, using their trade routes to spread information faster than royal couriers. This shifts our entire understanding of power dynamics. While kings drafted laws on parchment, bakers encoded counter-narratives in something far more pervasive: daily bread. Professor Miriam Rothschild's analysis of market regulations shows authorities obsessively controlling loaf shapes precisely because they feared this edible communication. A 14th-century Florentine edict specifically banned bread shaped in unusual forms, an admission that ordinary bakers had become architects of dissent. The most striking insight comes from comparing bread codes across cultures. In Moorish Spain, Jewish and Muslim bakers developed parallel systems, one using challah braids to mark safe houses, the other imprinting flatbreads with Quranic verses that doubled as rallying points. This wasn't isolated resistance, it was a shared language of survival that transcended religious divides. Similarly, Baltic rye breads and Mediterranean focaccias bore distinct markings, yet served identical purposes, proving oppression sparked universal ingenuity. Modern historians emphasize how these findings democratize our view of the past. The great man theory of history crumbles when we recognize that social change often rose from flour-dusted hands rather than royal decrees. As Cambridge scholar Dr. Oliver Thorne notes, the peasant who smuggled grain in a hollow loaf impacted more lives than most knights. His weapons were a wooden peel and communal trust. This recalibration matters today. It reminds us that progress has always relied on unseen networks of ordinary courage. The bread resistance legacy challenges academia's traditional hierarchies too. For years, culinary history was dismissed as trivial compared to political narratives until researchers realized recipes were encrypted manifestos. A team at the University of Bologna recently deciphered a 15th-century baker's journal, discovering what appeared to be baking temperatures were actually dates of planned uprisings. Such discoveries are forcing museums to reconsider their collections. That simple peasant bread stamp in the glass case, it's effectively a printing press for rebellion. What makes this perspective so vital is its timeliness. In an era of algorithmic surveillance and digital censorship, medieval bread codes offer a masterclass in analog resistance. They prove repressive systems always have cracks and that the most effective dissent often hides in what power considers beneath notice. From the hollow austerity loaves of economic protesters to the shared sourdough starters of pandemic mutual aid networks, the spirit of those medieval bakers lives wherever people transform daily sustenance into solidarity. Their ultimate lesson: history isn't just written by the victors, it's kneaded by the bakers, scored by the hungry, and consumed by everyone who refuses to swallow injustice. As we close this chapter, remember, every time you tear bread, you're handling more than food. You're holding the edible archive of humanity's quiet rebellions, a testament that no tyranny can fully control what nourishes both body and soul. The secret code of bread loaves isn't just a footnote in history, it's a masterclass in quiet defiance. Picture this: a simple loaf, warm from the oven, its crust scored with marks that meant nothing to kings but everything to the starving. What makes their story so extraordinary isn't just the bravery, but the brilliance of their methods. These bakers didn't storm castles or raise armies. they weaponized the one thing rulers couldn't confiscate without consequence: the daily bread that fed their oppressors' own subjects. Take the thunder loaves of Bohemia, dense rounds hiding saltpeter scraps that rebels later extracted for gunpowder, or the mirror breads of Italy, with one smooth side for inspectors and another textured with hidden maps. Even the humble pretzel's twists once signaled safe houses to those who knew how to read them. This wasn't just baking, it was alchemy, transforming flour and water into tools of liberation. What's perhaps most striking is how these edible codes blurred the line between survival and subversion. A baker couldn't openly refuse to feed soldiers, but they could shape loaves that made them sluggish, adding extra yeast to create bloated bread that spoiled faster, or kneading in mild laxatives to keep garrisons inconveniently indisposed. Others played the long game, subtly undersalting bread destined for royal tables until nobles complained of blandness, unknowingly advertising their detachment from a population too poor to afford salt. The legacy of these rebellious bakers lives on in ways we've forgotten to notice. That decorative slash on your baguette, it descends from medieval bakers' marks distinguishing rebel-friendly shops. The braided challah on Jewish tables, its twists once concealed counts of days until the next moonlit escape. Even the tradition of breaking bread together carries echoes of those covert meetings where torn loaf have served as admission tickets. But this story isn't just about the past, it's a mirror for our times. In an age of digital surveillance, their analog ingenuity feels newly relevant. Like the Belarusian protesters who used bakery deliveries to coordinate during internet blackouts, or the Chilean bakers who hid protest plans in the scoring patterns of mariquetas during the 2019 uprising. The medium changes, but the message remains. Oppression always underestimates the creativity of the oppressed. As you slice into your next loaf, let the crust's resistance under your knife remind you of the hands that once shaped dough into defiance. Every air pocket in the crumb, every caramelized ridge on the surface whispers of generations who refused to kneel. Their greatest victory wasn't any single act, but proving that even the most tightly controlled systems have cracks, and sometimes those cracks smell like freshly baked bread. Hungry for more hidden histories? Tell us in the comments which overlooked rebellions we should explore next. And don't forget to subscribe for stories that turn the crumbs of the past into feasts of discovery. After all, the best revolutions start with sharing something nourishing.